Chapter 4 is entitled Emotions and Mood, and obviously the extent to which those things affect workplace productivity and organizational behavior models in the first place. Historically, the idea about emotions and moods was to ignore them and to say, if you're in a bad mood, too bad. Pretend you're in a good mood. Work harder. And almost blame the people for having these moods and having these emotions, and essentially chalk it up to an issue of productivity. If you were in a bad mood, that means you weren't productive. That's your problem. And the emotions in general were considered to be detrimental based on the idea that managers tried to create this idea of a emotion-free organization where you don't worry about people's emotions, you don't have emotions. You check your emotions at the front door, become an automaton when you walk through the door, do your job, and then go home, and then when you leave you can have an emotion. Now, this thinking is changing because of the fact that people realize now that emotions they're real, and you can't just ignore them. You can pretend you don't have them, you can try to overcome them, but it's going to increase your productivity. If you're happy, it's going to decrease your productivity if you're sad. And the two things related to emotions, the emotions and moods, are both part of your affect. We discussed the affect a little bit in terms of the effect of commitment, where your emotional commitment to the organization. The affect is the overall mental state that impacts your behavior and your performance. Those are based on emotions, and they're based on mood. Emotions are more temporary. Emotions are more based on a specific event. Moods are more general and more long-term. Emotions created by a specific event, seconds or minutes, or hours, I guess. Specific and numerous in nature. You can be happy, you can be sad, and it could all be in 1 hour. And your action could be oriented in nature, not necessarily in anything that you have, logically made a decision to do. A mood, on the other hand, could last longer. It could last hours. It could last days. You could be in a good mood and a bad mood. Somebody who's in a bad mood, the colloquialism is the person woke up on the wrong side of the bed. It's more general, and it's cognitive. In other words, it's more affecting people's thinking, rather than something where a person gets angry. That anger could pass very quickly, whereas a mood could affect somebody's thinking over a long period of time because it lasts longer and it has more of an impact on someone. Whereas you might know that you're angry, you might know that you're sad, and you might realize that you shouldn't act on things when you're under the influence of that emotion. A mood is, people are a little bit less able to judge themselves. Well, I'm in a bad mood, I should be careful. Very often people are in a bad mood. That's the time that they're not careful. Okay, so next let's look at the basic emotions. Now, I don't have to tell you what these things are. You all know what anger, fear, sadness, happiness, disgust, and surprise are. They all have impacts, of course, as we'll discuss, on the productivity of an individual, how an individual does in the process of an organization. Anger obviously has the idea that a person it might act in a way to hurt someone rather than necessarily to help the organization. These things are not necessarily bad emotions. I don't know if there's such thing as a bad emotion. Fear, for example, is a very rational and very healthy emotion when channeled properly. When you see a car coming at you, jumping onto the sidewalk is very rational and a very good emotion to have. If we didn't have fear, we'd all be dead, because we wouldn't be afraid to do things that are dangerous, and we would just kill ourselves smiling. Sadness and happiness, we all understand how that could increase or decrease productivity. Disgust causes a person's morale to drop, and surprise could help someone by giving them extra motivation, especially if it's a pleasant surprise, or it could hurt someone because it catches them unprepared. When you look at the basic moods, when you look at basic emotions, you have to look at things that are positive and negative. Now, positive and negative in this case means in terms of how it's going to help or hurt the productivity of the person. A positive effect on a person means something that can help. Excitement, enthusiasm, or elation. Although you have to look at and this is a little complex. Let me back up for a second. You could have a high positive effect, which is something that's good, which increases the likelihood of doing something that is positive and will help in the long term. Or you could have a low positive effect, which is kind of the counterweight, where a person is now less likely to do something on the positive side. On the negative side, on the other hand, you have the opposite. You have stress, anxiety, nervousness. These are things that cause people to, or that hurt people's ability to perform properly. So you don't want the high end, but you do want the low end. The low end, serenity, calmness. What is calmness? Calmness essentially is the absence or the low amount of nervousness or stress. Serenity means having very little anxiety. So since anxiety is a high negative emotion, what you want is the low negative emotion. Here's an example of a little pie chart that I picked up that I think explains this a little bit better than just the slide. Over here you got the high positive affect and the high negative affect, the low positive affect, and the low negative affect. Obviously you want things that are in the positive axis, in this diagonal from here to here. You want things that are up here, you don't want things that are down there, because think of positive as a potential for positive. So the potential for positive is great when you have emotions that help you get towards that area. You're excited, you're elated, you're happy, you're alert. Where on the other hand, if you just have low energy, so to speak, you're more in this quadrant. We're depressed, bored, fatigued. These in and of themselves, what they really mean is that you just have low energy to affect these positive things. Negative things, like nervousness, tension, being upset, stressed, these are all obviously things that will hurt the ability to produce. And so what you want is the low end of that scale. And the low end of that scale is being serene, content, calm, or relaxed. So now let's discuss moods, emotions, and where they come from. Positive moods, believe it or not, are more common than negative moods. I know it doesn't seem like that with many people, but we are actually in states of elation, states of happiness, more than we are in terms of negative. But when most people add zero input, which means on a standard day, if nothing is necessarily good with the day and nothing's necessarily bad with the day, we tend to be in a slightly positive mood, a slightly good mood. When we ordinarily go about our daily business, assuming that there were no other variables in play, we'd be in a slightly positive mood. But of course, that doesn't mean anything in real life because there's never really a situation where there's nothing else at play. There are lots of other things at play, as we'll see a little bit later on. Before that, there are a couple of important things that emotions do. They have an effect on rationality. They even have an effect on ethics. Their effect on rationality is that emotions are critical to rational thought. They help us understand the world around them, and therefore people's emotions could actually interfere with their judgment and interfere with them being rational. People who are extremely sad or extremely depressed tend to be irrational. People who are, God forbid, suicidal are at the point where they're so irrational that they think that they may think that that the most rational thing is to not go on living. Whereas if they, if they go make it through that period, and then 5-6 months later they might go back and think, how could I have ever thought that in the first place? People aren't necessarily, when they're overly emotional, they're not necessarily always thinking completely rationally. Research even suggests that ethical behavior could be based on emotions and feelings, and I think that's almost obvious, where people who are feeling happy are more likely to try to behave in an ethical way, where people who are sad or upset may just not care as much about ethics. So where do people get their emotions and mood? There's a lot of examples here. Their personality. Some people are predisposed to being happy, and some people are predisposed to being excited or nervous. There's affect intensity. In other words, you can be experiencing a positive mood that's very strong, or you can be experiencing a positive mood that's kind of weak. Time of day. They say, for example, when people hit the sugar rush, sugar fall after lunch, a couple hours after lunch, they say like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, people are at their lowest. They get kind of, they get their energy from lunch, and then it kind of goes downhill a little bit, and then it kind of goes back up, and people are stronger again at 4 and 5 o'clock. But that impacts people's mood. Maybe when it's 9 a.m. and they've had a good night's sleep, maybe they're in a better mood. Maybe when it's late at night and they're tired, maybe they're not in as good a mood. Day of the week, for fairly obvious reasons, people tend to be in their best mood on the weekend when they're off. Weather doesn't have that much impact. Some people say, "Oh, I'm in a bad mood. It's a rainy day." I guess according to studies, it doesn't really matter that much. I don't think it will surprise anybody that increased stress worsens mood. Social activities increase positive mood. Getting together with people, having friends, having activities that help people social lives helps their mood. And sleep is also important. Lack of sleep increases negative emotions and impairs decision making. Getting that 7 hours a night, 7.5 hours a night, could actually make you be more productive than getting 6 hours because you're working too much. Exercise enhances positive mood. It makes people feel better about themselves, gets the endorphins going and floating around the bloodstream. So exercise definitely sometimes when people are in the middle of the day, if they're kind of feeling blah and feeling depressed, very often go out and take a little jog. Just do something, get your blood going. That can actually help. Older people actually experience negative emotions less frequently. Maybe they figure, I don't know, I'm not going to speculate. Maybe they figure that they're more set in their ways and they don't have to worry as much about their future. And gender. Women show greater emotional expression, experience emotions more intently, and display more frequent emotions than do men. These are just some examples of things that actually affect moods and emotions. A couple of other cute little concepts when it comes to emotions and organizational behavior. Emotional labor is the employee's expression of organizationally desired emotions during interpersonal transactions at work. Just to give you one example, sometimes if you work for an airline or if you work for something where you have a lot of customers and not all of them are going to be satisfied because they have weather delays and they have all sorts of things, sometimes the company would like you to show sympathy and like you to show sadness over the customer's plight even though you can't do anything about it. Person comes and says, my flight was delayed for 4 hours because there was a thunderstorm and now I'm not going to get home and I'm going to miss Uncle John's wedding and I'm going to blah, blah, blah. And then the customer starts yelling and screaming and there's really nothing the customer service agent can do about it. But if the customer service agent says, I'm so sorry to hear about your situation. I really feel bad for you, and I really hope that Uncle John will be okay without you. Then that's the sort of thing that can actually help, and that's almost you're working. You're displaying emotions as part of your labor, as part of your job. You may not actually feel those emotions, or you may actually feel those emotions, but either way, that's an example of emotional labor. And you have emotional dissonance just like you have cognitive dissonance. Remember, cognitive dissonance is you want something and you don't want it. You have ambivalency. You have conflicting feelings. Well, you could also have conflicting emotions. An employee has to project one emotion while simultaneously feeling another. You're feeling absolutely miserable. You don't care that the customer missed Uncle John's funeral because you've had a really bad day, and besides, there are 17,000 other customers who are also upset about the same thunderstorm, and there's nothing you could have done about it anyway. So really, you're just annoyed at the customer for making a big deal. But nevertheless, if you could, draw a face like an undertaker and express sympathy and express heartfelt commiseration, then that will actually help, even though that's kind of your emotional dissonance where you're you're projecting an emotion that you don't necessarily feel, which really leads us to this idea of felt emotions versus displayed emotions. Those obviously can be very different. Felt emotions are what you actually feel. Displayed emotions are what you display to customers, to coworkers, to whomever. And doing this, having that dichotomy, having this emotional dissonance, displaying these emotions requires acting, just like an actor. Surface acting is hiding one's true emotions, which customer service representatives have to do all the time. Telephone representatives who may be annoyed that people are complaining about something that they can't do anything about have to figure out a way to show commiseration and sympathy. Then there's deep acting. Deep acting means actually trying to change your feelings. That's obviously much harder to actually do than simply surface acting. Next, we've got the effective events theory, which may almost seem obvious, but it's actually somewhat controversial. Theory that not everybody agrees with, but the theory is that employees react emotionally to things that happen to them at work, and this influences their job performance. A little chart that explains how this works is that characteristics of the jobs, demands, etc., plus, in other words, when added to things like daily hassles or daily uplifts, positive feedback you get from people, can lead, plus factoring in the third factor, the emotions, personality, mood of the individual can combine to cause emotional reactions. They could be positive or negative, and they lead to either job satisfaction or dissatisfaction. Again, this may seem fairly obvious that all of these things, I thought it was pretty obvious that all of these things combine to add up to job satisfaction or dissatisfaction, but just remember those three elements. You got the element of the work environment itself, you got the element of the events that happen at work, and you've got the disposition, you've got the personality of or the mood of the individual. And all of that leads to this affect that can be positive or negative when it comes to a working environment. Emotional intelligence is not clear whether it actually exists. Emotional intelligence is this idea that a person has a higher ability to read other people's emotions, understand those people's emotions than other people. Basically, the emotional intelligence is the person's ability to perceive emotions in themselves and in other people, understand those emotions, and actually react to those emotions, regulate the emotions. Those three things basically are the idea of emotional intelligence, where somebody has an increased ability to do these things over somebody else. That's the idea of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence takes on certain characteristics. Conscientiousness means the ability to perceive emotions in the self and others. Somebody who's able to make sure to see everything or to pick up on subtle cues. That's somebody who looks deeply into all these cues. In terms of being conscientious, will allow the person to pick up on these subtle cues and perceive those emotions, perceive that somebody else is sad, perceive that somebody else is happy. There's cognitive, remember cognitive, which we've seen a few times, and cognitive dissonance and a few other times. Cognitive means when you're thinking about something and how you're thinking about it. And so the cognitive aspect of emotional intelligence is understanding the meaning of those emotions. And then you have the emotional stability aspect, which is the ability to regulate your own emotions. Those are really the three things that go into emotional intelligence. Picking up on clues, picking up on subtle cues of others, thinking about everything, making sure to quickly process a lot of information. Conscientiousness allows you to perceive emotions and how they are. It could be in yourself also, not just in others. Cognitive is the ability essentially to think about them and to understand them, and to realize, again, it could be in yourself, could be in others. In others, it could be, well, you see the person's face droop and you figure the person is probably sad, and see what other clues you've seen in the person today. In yourself, cognitive is a way where you're thinking about it enough to realize that maybe you're only acting out because you're upset, whereas you don't really feel that way. And then there's the idea, the emotional stability of a person is the ability of the person to regulate their emotions. Do they act out every time they're upset, or are they able to control themselves and wait for a day or wait for an hour where they're a little bit less moody? That's the idea of the ability really to regulate the emotions. All these things combined form this vague concept that we call emotional intelligence. So why did I say before that it's not clear whether it exists? Well, because some people don't like the concept. The case for emotional intelligence is, well, it's intuitive. It's obvious. I think my guess is that most of you watching figured, yeah, some people have a little bit more of an innate knack for reading other people. People are able to tell whether they're upset. It also can predict criteria that can correlate to high job performance. If it actually works, then it can be very useful. That's another reason to try to study it and say that it does work. And studies show that emotional intelligence can be based on neurologically, where it's not just a matter of people building up their own personality. It could actually be based on something that's in your brain, something that's almost genetic. People can have a predisposition to a higher emotional intelligence. The other side, the other case against, is not really so much, if you look at the theme of the stuff on the right half of the slide over here, it's not so much arguments that emotional intelligence don't exist, but it's more arguments against the use of emotional intelligence for anything significant. The idea that it's just too vague a concept. It's too hard to measure. How can you measure? With intelligence, maybe you can measure with IQ points. You could say a person has 115 IQ. It's very hard to measure a person's emotional intelligence. I guess somebody could write a test where you have to look at a person's face and pick up subtle clues and say whether that person's angry or happy, and maybe they have images that get somebody annoyed, and you have to control your emotions. I guess that's possible, but that hasn't really been done to this point. And the other idea is that emotional intelligence, is so closely related to personality and intelligence that it doesn't really matter that much. When you look at a person's personality, they're calm, they're angry, they're upset, they're happy, they're upbeat, they're downbeat, they're depressed. And then you look at a person's intelligence, you take those two things combined, you don't really have that much room for a need for emotional intelligence. And how a person regulates his or her emotions could be almost as important as what those emotions actually are. It's one thing to have emotions. We all get upset, we all get fearful, we all are happy from time to time, we all are excited from time to time. Well, what can we do about them? So this idea of emotional regulation, channeling our emotions properly, is identifying and modifying the emotions that we feel. We can acknowledge the emotional response, and we can be open with people, where I'm happy, I'm sad. We can vent. That's one aspect of emotional regulations. To finish off the chapter, let's look at some ideas of how somebody who specializes in organizational behavior, somebody who's a human resources professional, can take these emotions and moods and morph them into something that can be useful in terms of making HR decisions and in terms of running a company. Well, selections. Employers should consider emotional intelligence, again, without using that term so strictly. I know I mentioned before that some people don't like the whole concept, but I mean a person's propensities, a person's mood, how a person behaves in a certain way for hiring jobs that demand a high degree of social interactions. I mentioned before the airline customer service representatives. If you're going to get somebody who has a short tantrum or has a short temper, and somebody that's prone to getting upset very easily, they're not going to be a very good airline customer service representative. I mean, they may be good in the back room crunching numbers. They may be good in the boardroom making decisions for the company. But in terms of speaking to customers whose flights were delayed for 4 hours due to a thunderstorm, they're not going to be very good at it. You have to be realistic about whose skills translate into which jobs. Decision making. Positive emotions can increase problem-solving skills. Certainly the application of people, if you're able to get them happy, well, that could increase their ability to think in a way that is positive and in a way that can help problem solve. And positive moods can even increase creativity. Other things include motivation. Positive moods motivate people. People who are happy are more motivated. They feel better about themselves. They feel better about their jobs. They feel better about their lives, and they want to increase their productivity. Leadership, positive emotions, upbeat emotions help convey these things to people who are underlings, to people who if you've ever worked for somebody and that person is very, very positive, you're going to have a very different attitude than if that person is very negative. Negotiation. Being too angry may impair your ability to negotiate a good deal. That's actually a critical factor in terms of negotiation. There was once a line from The Godfather. I remember watching the movie once where the father, Marlon Brando, tells the son, Sonny, that you never let them see you angry. Like he was in the middle of a conference and he got upset and he yelled at them or whatever it is, and he said, you never let them see you get angry, because you let them know, you let the opponents know in the negotiation that they can get under your skin. You want to play it close to the vest. You want to play it like when you're playing a poker match. You don't draw a card and say, "Oh man, that's terrible." That would just be giving it away. You want to try to stay as neutral as possible. Customer service. Customers catch emotions from employees, which they call emotional contagion, and they can tell whether you're annoyed or not. And you want to try to convey as positive a message as possible. And job attitudes. Obviously, people who are emotional that affects their job attitude. They say that studies show that they don't carry over to the next day, but still they can affect you that day. Deviance in terms of behaviors, people who have negative emotions like anger or sadness or fear are likely to break company policy. And finally, when you're talking about safety, that's also something that you have to worry about when you're talking about emotions and moods. People who are despondent, people who are upset, people who are angry are more likely to behave in a manner that is reckless. So these are all things that people who are organizational behavior professionals have to watch out for when you're talking about emotions and moods.